When we think about the devastating effects that a war can have on a civilian population, I think it makes sense that more often than not we think about modern-day conflicts. We think about the wars that we are facing now, and we think of 21st and 20th century conflicts, those which are still in lasting memory for us all, or at least for our families. When we think of a widow and her children sitting at home, crying and trying to keep up the strength when they realize that their father, their husband, their brother, their son will never be coming home, we think about the families of our own veterans, the people who have to deal with that struggle on a regular basis. And it makes sense that that's the case. We don't think about a historical struggle because it's so far removed from our own experiences. And of all the time periods to associate with the devastation of conflict among a civilian population, we don't think of the 18th century, we don't think of the early 19th century, we think of the Second and First World Wars. We think of, the time periods where a civilian population might be put under direct threat from an invading or sacking army. Those who are inclined to ancient history may even think to that sort of thing, because that, in a very real, a very direct way, we can imagine a civilian population being invested in a war effort because their very lives depend on it. But when we look to a period such as, say, the Napoleonic Wars, all of a sudden things become a lot more messy. They become more muddled as far as how it affects a civilian population. Because, of course, while in places like Russia, Germany, France, these wars, and Spain especially, these wars really did affect a civilian population to a great degree, well, it's a lot easier to not think about that so much as it is to think of the splendid uniforms, the flying colors, the marching of the soldiers, the beating of the drums, the pageantry, the spectacle, the brilliance of the whole thing, the heroism, the story, the fantasy that we sell ourselves. We don't usually think about the struggle of the individual men in those lines of battle. And of course, in this channel, I oftentimes try and bring to light the genuine suffering, the hardships, the privations that men and soldiers would face during this time period, because while the uniforms may be pretty, the experience of the men certainly was not. That being said, however, it's very rare that I actually talk about the other side of things. The soldiers' wives and their children, and while it's a very long topic, and I don't really have the time to be getting into it very, very deeply today, I think it would be worthwhile for us to look at an individual experience, an individual account of suffering, the likes of which would have been, sadly, remarkably common during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of a camp follower, which, much contrary to popular belief, no, that doesn't just refer to scrupulous businessmen trying to make money off of the army and prostitutes desperate for survival by following the men. No, indeed, camp followers, more often than not, and more prevalent than anything else, took the form of the wives and families of the soldiers whom they followed, and they performed, of course, a great many auxiliary roles for the army, the least of which being things like clothing repair and laundry and food preparation, things like that. But this isn't going to be a video about the usual experience of a camp follower in the army, but rather I want to again cover the experience of what happens to one of those women, to one of those families, one of those camp followers, when they realize that the man that they were attached to, when their husbands died out in the field. And for this, I should like to turn to a book titled The Recollections of Rifleman Harris. It's an incredible book. Quite literally, it is the memoirs of a rifleman from the Napoleonic Wars in the 95th, that most famous regiment. And unlike many other recollections, or unlike many other pieces regarding this time period, it wasn't from an officer, it isn't from any sort of historian, or this is direct from the mouth, I should say, not the pen, but direct from the mouth of a soldier from the time period, an enlisted common man. He was a shepherd before he enlisted into the armed forces. Indeed, it was an officer who found Harris after the war who sat him down and recorded these experiences because, of course, Rifleman Harris himself could not write. This may be a book that, in fact, it most certainly will be a book that we cover more about in the future because it is absolutely fascinating. But again, for now, I should like to relate one individual experience, which I think may be useful for us, which may be something to dwell on when we consider the topic of how civilians suffered from the privations of war during this time period. At length, after a sharp contest, we forced them, the French, to give ground, and following them up, drove them from their position in the heights, and hung upon their skirts until they made another stand, and then the game began again. He's describing a battle, a conflict. The rifles indeed fought well this day, and we lost many men. They seemed in high spirits, and delighted in having driven the enemy before them. Joseph Cochan was by my side, loading and firing very industriously about this period of the day. Thirsting with heat and action, he lifted his canteen to his mouth. "Here's to you, old boy," he said as he took a pull at its contents. As he did so, a bullet went through the canteen, and perforating his brain, killed him in a moment. Another man fell close to him almost immediately, struck by a ball in the thigh. Indeed, we caught it severely just here, and the old iron was also playing its part amongst our poor fellows very merrily. I saw a man named Simmons struck full in the face by a round shot, and he came to the ground, a headless trunk. Meanwhile, many large balls bounded along the ground amongst us so deliberately that we could occasionally evade them without difficulty. I could relate many more of the casualties I witnessed on this day, but the above will suffice. When the roll was called after the battle, so now this is again after the engagement, when the men, having been recalled to camp, are lined up, and individual roll calls being called among the men, names to see if they are still there. When the roll was called after the battle, the females who missed their husbands came along the front of the line to inquire of the survivors whether they knew anything about them. Amongst other names, I heard that of Cochan called, in a female voice, without being replied to. The name struck me, and I observed the poor woman who had called it, as she stood sobbing before us, and apparently afraid to make further inquiries about her husband. No man had answered to his name, or had any account to give of his fate. I myself had observed him fall, as related before, whilst drinking from his canteen, but I looked at the poor, sobbing creature before me. I felt unable to tell her of his death. At length Captain Leach observed her, and called out to the company, "Does any man here know what happened to Cochan? If so, let him speak at once." Upon this order I immediately related what I had seen, and told the manner of his death. After a while, Mrs. Cochan appeared anxious to see the spot where her husband fell, and in the hope of still finding him alive, asked me to accompany her over the field. She trusted, notwithstanding what I had told her, to yet find him alive. "Do you think you can find it?" said Captain Leach, upon being referred to. I told him I was sure I could, as I had remarked many objects while looking for cover during the skirmishing. "Go then," said the captain, "and show the poor woman the spot, as she seems so desirous of finding the body." I accordingly took my way over the ground we had fought upon, she following and sobbing after me, and quickly reaching the spot where her husband's body lay, pointed it out to her. She now soon discovered all her hopes were in vain. She embraced the stiffened corpse, and after rising and contemplating his disfigured face for some minutes, with hands clasped and tears streaming down her cheeks, she took a prayer book from her pocket, and kneeling down, repeated the service of the dead over the body. When she had finished, she appeared a good deal comforted, and I took the opportunity of beckoning to a pioneer I saw near with some other men, and together we dug a hole, and quickly buried the body. Mrs. Cochan then returned with me to the company to which her husband had been attached, and laid herself down upon the heath near us. She lay amongst some other females, who were in the same distressing circumstances with herself, with the sky for her canopy, and a turf for her pillow, for we had no tents with us. Poor woman! I pitied her so much, but there was no remedy. If she had been a duchess, she must have fared the same. She was a handsome woman, I remember, and the circumstance of my having seen her husband fall and accompanied her to find his body begot a sort of intimacy between us. The company to which Cochan had belonged, bereaved as she was now her home, and she marched and took equal fortune with us to Vimiero. She hovered about us during that battle, and then went with us to Lisbon, where she succeeded in procuring a passage to England. Such was my first acquaintance with Mrs. Cochan. The circumstances of our intimacy were singular, and an attachment grew between us during the short time we remained together. What little attention I could pay her during the hardships of the march I did, and I also offered, on the first opportunity, to marry her. She had, however, received too great a shock on the occasion of her husband's death ever to think of another soldier, she said. She therefore thanked me for my good feeling towards her, but declined my offer, and left us soon afterwards for England. The recollections of Rifleman Harris, and indeed pretty much every soldier's memoir from this period that I have ever read, are filled with examples like this, of women whose husbands have been lost being sort of adopted by the company that their man belonged to, before finally somehow being able to procure some passage home. I should like to just draw your attention to a few of the details which tell us a little bit more about life during this time period, which we can get from that singular account. The first of which being that there was no system in place, not as we know it today, to actually inform women when something happened to their husbands. Let alone if they happened to be in England at the time and they might receive word somehow of how their husband was lost, let alone, of course, receiving the simple word that he had been killed either in battle or perhaps lost from sickness while on campaign, if you even get that amount of detail. Imagine being one of the dozens of women standing behind in camp, looking out as the column slowly approaches from the field of battle, the direction, of course, from which you had heard all day the firing of cannon, the pealing of musketry, and the screaming of wounded men and horses. You see the column slowly approaching, not nearly so gaily and or heroically as it had first gone off. They approach more slowly. If there is a drumbeat at all, it's probably a weary one. And as they get closer and closer, the apprehension building up within you, you begin to pick out individual men in the ranks. You begin to pick out where the missing files are, and you begin desperately scanning the crowd for where your husband may be. He's not where he normally is, but maybe he's in someone else's place. Maybe he's somewhere behind. Maybe he's one of the many countless men slowly limping back behind the column, using their musket or their rifle as some sort of crutch, desperately attempting to make it back to aid in the camp. You scan the faces, and one after another, they turn up blank. You don't see him in the crowd. The soldiers are lined up, as was the case in this little account of ours. The soldiers are lined up, and as the roll call is called, you realize that your husband isn't there. Desperately, in one strange last hope, you begin calling out your beloved's name, hoping against hope that he'll pop his head out from behind one of his fellows and say, "Don't worry, dear, I'm here. I'm all right after all." Yet it never comes. You look to the eyes of the individual men who you knew were his cronies throughout the entire campaign, and when they meet your gaze, they look down, shameful, as if they don't want to admit what happened. Mrs. Cochan was standing there alone, crying, until one officer, a certain Captain Leach, took pity on the figure and called out on her behalf, "Does anyone know what happened to this woman's husband?" At which point, finally, one of the many riflemen raises his hand and he says that he does know what happened to the husband. He explains the situation. There's no chance, and you know it on at least some level, that your husband is still alive. But still, the hope remains, and you implore the man to at least take you to the body. You spend a few moments trawling through piles of corpses after an engagement, searching through, scanning every marred and disfigured face and mutilated body, until finally you do come across that body. The soldier standing behind awkwardly, not knowing what to do with himself, as you kneel down and cradle the mutilated corpse in your arms, weeping, for you know that with his death, your life is changed forever. There are no arrangements to bury the body, as we've learned. It's up to that soldier to track down a few pioneers who happen to be passing through the battle, probably looting the corpses, to come over begrudgingly and dig a shallow grave for your husband in the middle of some foreign field, in a foreign land, far away from home. A few days, possibly weeks, even months later, after following the army on campaign, trying your best to survive in those terrible circumstances, finally, after all of the usual privations of a march that you had been dealing with for so long, but now without companionship, finally you're able to find passage back to England. You say farewell to the men of your husband's company who had taken care of you for so long and whom you have built such a close relationship with. Those men who you relied on just as they had relied on you to get through those times. Hopefully, after you arrive, you have enough money in your pockets to find your way back home, wherever that may well be, where perhaps a father or some brother would be able to take care of you until you are able to marry again, not being willing, as has been detailed, to go through the terrible pain of being married to a soldier. And so, my dear viewer, I think that one of the most important lessons that we can take away from history and from personal accounts such as this one is that no matter what the time period, no matter what the conflict, no matter what the reason, that when a soldier marches to war, he doesn't do it alone, because he marches with his entire family, be they in heart, in mind, or even in person. Until the next time, my dear viewers, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.
Bonaparte commanded his troops for to stand, and he planted his cannons all over the land, and he planted his cannons, the whole victory for to gain, and they killed my light horseman returning from Spain. Broken hearted I will wander for the loss of my lover. He is my bonny light horseman,